You are now staring into the twisted mirror.
What if you were sentenced to death, but you just didn't know it? You followed your typical daily routine: wake up, have your morning coffee, maybe go for a run. You shower, have breakfast, hop into your car or public transit, and then walk into work, the place that provides your livelihood. On that day, though, it would be the place of your doom. And as you mark things off from your to do list or have a friendly chat with a colleague, you have no idea that you're already in the process of dying. That something in the midst of that mostly ordinary day is just a little bit different. That the precautions you take, the routines, the good habits, none of that will save you. This is True Horror Breached. It was Monday, August 14th, 1978. Janet Parker, a 40-year-old photographer for Birmingham University's medical school in the UK, did not show up to work. Her coworker, Glenda Miller, a research technician, called her up to check in. Janet had been feeling ill since the previous Friday when she woke up with a pounding headache. She felt she might be coming down with a flu, but insisted on showing up to work anyway, as she had lots of work to do. Her husband Joseph drove her to work, but despite her willpower, her condition had only gotten worse over the weekend. By the time Monday rolled around and Miller called, Janet had developed red spots throughout her chest, limbs, and face. Her doctor stopped by for a house call and diagnosed her with chickenpox. Janet's mother was skeptical of the diagnosis. She had nursed her daughter to health when she contracted chickenpox as a child, and this looked completely different. The red spots had erupted into pus-filled boils, not the blistery, itchy rash typically seen with chickenpox. The boils were all over her body, whereas chickenpox usually stays on the stomach, chest, and back, and rarely makes it to the palms of hands and soles of feet. "I've never felt so ill in my life," she told her friend before they ended their conversation. By the 20th of August, with no signs of improvement and unable to even stand on her own, Janet was admitted to Catherine de Barnes Isolation Hospital in Solihull, 9 days after her initial flu-like symptoms. Professor Deborah Simmons was the first of the medical staff to see her. As she examined the patient, the impossible crossed her mind. It couldn't be, but she wrote it in her notes. Variola. Variola, the medical name for smallpox, was on its way to being declared eradicated. The last natural case had occurred in Somalia in 1977. The World Health Organization had led an aggressive global vaccination program, and by the 70s, cases were rare and scattered. With just one case the previous year, the WHO was preparing itself to declare victory over this thousands-year-old disease. And the final cases, they were typically in areas with poor sanitation or lack of access to advanced healthcare, not in a city in the UK. Until the development of a vaccine, smallpox was a deadly part of life. When it didn't kill, it often left its victims disfigured. While it killed 30% of its victims, its highly contagious nature and high mortality rates among babies and children left large numbers of death in its wake. It was contagious from a sneeze or cough or contact with surfaces, especially bedding and clothes, as the oozing sores left the virus behind, even when the sores had crusted. Smallpox is believed to have been around for 3,000 to 4,000 years, and the virus behind so many outbreaks described in history books I couldn't possibly list them all. In the 18th century, smallpox was one of the leading causes of death, killing 1 out of every 7 Russian children. In Europe, it took approximately 400,000 lives a year, and that is just one zoomed-in view of location and time. In the Americas, it is thought to be responsible for wiping out nearly all of the natives, as they had absolutely no immunity to this virus. When Herman Cortez invaded what is now known as Mexico, he had initially been driven away by the large number of Aztecs. However, with him was a secret weapon, a smallpox-infected soldier. When he returned, the disease had done to the Aztecs what no earlier army could. It had killed nearly all of the Aztec army and decimated 25% of the general population. Spanish Franciscan Montolinia left this description: as the Indians did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps like bedbugs. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, they pulled down the houses over them so that their homes became their tombs. It was said that the Spaniards could not walk through the streets without stepping on the bodies of smallpox victims. There are various forms of smallpox. The most common, called ordinary smallpox, while being miserable, is the least deadly, with an unvaccinated death rate of about 9.3%. Ordinary confluent smallpox, where the pustules merge together to form sheets of skin that detach from its victims, was closer to 60%. Malignant smallpox had a nearly 100% death rate. In this type, the lesions seemed to stay under the skin, never fully rising to form leaky pustules, but the postdromal phase, after the pox had formed and scabbed, was much more severe, and the virus would travel to the bloodstream. Days before death, the velvety lesions would turn ashen gray and the victim's stomach would distend. For those who knew of the different variations and their symptoms, this was a harbinger of certain death. Finally, hemorrhagic smallpox, a rare form, does not come with the typical pustules, but instead the body bleeds into the skin, mucous membranes, gastrointestinal tract, and viscera. The victim appears charred and black, earning this variant the nickname of blackpox. Terrifyingly, vaccination does not appear to provide immunity to this form. So I think it's clear why, when on August 24th, Janet was confirmed to have smallpox, the World Health Organization, also known as the WHO, whipped into action. With the incubation period being 12 days, that gave the organization a lot to worry about. How many people had she been in contact with for the nearly 2-week period? Were they now going about their lives unaware of the horrific disease multiplying inside of them? Furthermore, where did she get it? Was patient zero still out there infecting others? The WHO sought out every single person who had gotten in contact with her, from her husband and mother to the cleaning staff at the hospital, and vaccinated and quarantined them. Speed was of the essence, as in the case of smallpox, an injection given within 3 days of exposure can offer some level of protection. Dr. Surinder Bakshi was an unlikely medical officer for Birmingham at the time. He grew up in Sikh Dar es Salaam, East Africa, went on to study medicine in Uganda, and worked in Zambia, and then gained his master's in public health in the US before moving to the UK in 1974. It wasn't his lack of credentials that surprised him when he was offered the position, but his beard, brown skin, and turban made him an outsider. He was an immigrant, and immigrants usually had to work their way up from the bottom. In a Guardian article, he said, "When I started work, people wouldn't speak to me, not even my secretary, for a couple of weeks. I used to tell my wife, I feel very sorry for them. They look at me and feel unhappy." Less than a year later, he would be called to stop the spread of smallpox in Birmingham and the rest of the UK. He and his boss put together an advisory committee and launched an extensive plan with a huge budget to trace everyone who had made contact with Parker. From various command centers, staff fielded nervous calls as news broke to the press, and they tracked all those who made contact with Parker, including a couple who had already traveled overseas. Trips and weddings had to be postponed. Those with close contact to Parker had the strictest quarantine of 16 days, while others, like the paperboy, were surveilled. Some broke their quarantines and were promptly reported by neighbors. Bakshi made a point to visit every single person who had made contact instead of outsourcing the delivery of the terrifying news. Within 2 weeks of her symptoms making their first appearance, nearly 500 people had made the contact list and were treated. What made this case so shocking was not only that smallpox was thought to be eradicated, but its current location. The previous thought to be final case was in Somalia. A 23-year-old man named Ali Mayal Malin, who had worked as a vaccinator for a smallpox eradication program but had never gotten one himself. While most of the world had gotten rid of smallpox, poorer countries with infrastructure challenges still had cases from time to time due to remote areas being isolated from the benefit of herd immunity provided by the vaccination program. Targeting those in contact with Malin took action movie-like efforts from the vaccination team, including using elephants as transportation and doctors swimming across rivers with equipment on their heads. By the end of this massive effort, over 54,000 people were vaccinated, and smallpox was eradicated from the population, only existing in another case had not popped up for a year, until Janet Parker. But Janet did not live in an isolated village far away from routine medical care or in a population with extremely low vaccination rates. She worked in a university in an industrialized nation, in a popular city with a population that had access to hospitals and mass vaccinations. So how on earth did she contract this ancient but effectively extinct disease? While we will never know for sure the exact circumstances of how Parker contracted this virus, it's agreed that yes, smallpox was eradicated from the population, and she contracted it from one of the only places it was known to have continued on, in a research laboratory. Janet was a medical photographer, and her studio was on the first floor of the Birmingham Medical School, one floor above the Department of Medical Microbiology. The department had a pox laboratory and held one of the more lethal forms of smallpox within a small sealed room. Professor Henry Bedson was the head of this department, which was one of fewer than 20 to hold this virus. Bedson was an expert in pox viruses and instrumental in the eradication program with the WHO. While confident that smallpox was eradicated, there was the fear that a new pox could jump from animal to human in the future, and Bedson's research focused on preparing for this. That May, Bedson visited St. Mary's Medical School, one of the other labs that held virulent pox viruses, and obtained an exceptionally deadly strain called a bead, named after one of the 2 patients from whom it was isolated. Bedson transported it himself back to Birmingham, 120 miles away, where work on the strain began in mid-July. Alasdair Geddes, a consultant in infectious diseases who would be working on Parker's case, called Bedson after Parker was admitted to the hospital. "I have a suspected smallpox here, Henry, and it's a lady who works as a photographer in the medical school." He said the line went quiet. Later, at around 8 p.m., Geddes arrived at Parker's bedside to collect samples and met Bedson at his lab. At around 10 p.m., Bedson slid the samples into a microscope. Geddes asked what he saw. Again, no words. Geddes took the stunned professor's spot in front of the microscope, and there they were, brick-shaped viruses. Unmistakably, smallpox. Bedson didn't have to say the words. His silence was confirmation alone. He knew this had to have come from his lab, which was just beneath where Parker worked. A man who made it his life's work to eradicate this horrendous and deadly disease and to prevent it from coming back in any form, knew his lab was responsible for this infection, for this woman's suffering. Catherine DeBarnes Isolation Hospital, where Janet was taken, was an eerie place. Built in 1910 for the isolation of diseases past, such as typhoid, diphtheria, and tuberculosis, and yes, smallpox. The buildings had since sat deserted, waiting for an awakening of another deadly outbreak. Now only homes to the ghosts of those who had already died far away from civilization. Rows of hospital beds sat empty, the occasional pattering of a nurse's footsteps the likely only sound to break the silence. It had been 11 years since a new patient had been admitted to the hospital. Linda Sutherland, a nurse who had signed onto a list of infectious disease nurses willing to take on these high-risk isolation cases, received a call. She was told to pack a bag and wait for a taxi. When Parker was first admitted, she was coherent, sitting up in bed with reading materials and a radio by her bedside. She sat alone in a ward full of empty beds. Sutherland and Mary Neary, another nurse on the task, traded 8-hour shifts tending to their patient. Parker's condition deteriorated rapidly, and soon she was unable to change her own nightgown or even blow her nose without assistance. There was not much to be done except provide comfort and hope for a miracle. Sutherland would gently bathe her and apply treatment to her sore-riddled skin and mouth. She got her a blow-up ripple bed to alleviate the pressure on Parker's raw skin. They encouraged her to eat soft foods through her painfully sore mouth. By the end of week 1, a sore burst over Parker's eye, making it almost impossible to read. Her hair caked in the oozing sores along her upper back. While some illnesses almost mercifully take their victims into a twilight state or coma so that they are not aware of their decline, this was not the case with Parker, who had a mirror and observed the open pus-filled sores that made their way into the palms of her hands. Sutherland said once she saw tears creep down her inflamed cheeks. Others were admitted to the isolation hospital, but they were false alarms, simply immune system reactions to the vaccine rather than the disease itself. But Parker's illness would contribute to other deaths. On September 3rd, Parker's father, 71, woke up feeling nauseated and was taken to another ward in the hospital. The next day, he died of a suspected heart attack that was thought to have been triggered by the extreme stress brought on by his daughter's grave illness. It would be confirmed that Parker did in fact have the Abid strain, the one Bedson had transported to his hospital and began to work on in mid-July. He was distraught by the news. As the rumors swirled, the press swarmed his home as he quarantined with his wife and 3 children. Accusations of irresponsibility and a breach of technique by him and his staff distressed him greatly. Peter Wildley in Sir Gordon Wolstenholme wrote, "Journalists launched a relentless effort to fix the blame on him and his staff for a breach of technique, and union officials stirred up public fears by confusing the issues with those then arising from genetic manipulation. Harassed as the chosen villain of the tragedy, Henry Bedson's normally stable personality broke down. Just one day after confirming the strain of the virus, Dr. Bedson cut his own throat open while at home with his family. He died 5 days later on September 6th. In his suicide note, he wrote, "I am sorry to have misplaced the trust which so many of my friends and colleagues have placed in me and my work." But was Bedson truly responsible for Parker's infection? One theory was Parker was exposed through the vents that blew air out into the courtyard, and then the air would have traveled up to the telephone room on Parker's floor, where she took several calls that day. However, the room that held the virus was sealed, and why would she be the only person infected by this particularly virulent strain when there were others who would have inhaled air from the same vents? Even if the air made it to her floor, the experts state this would be unlikely as the lab was working with diluted materials, and such a small droplet making its way all the way up to her would simply not have contained enough virus to make her so sick. A more credible theory as to why the virus only made its way to Parker in large enough amounts to infect her was that the virus did not float up to the photography studio, but that she had come to it. A similar case had happened years before in 1966. Tony McLennan, 23 at the time, also worked as a photographer in the medical school. He, like Parker, also contracted smallpox, albeit a much milder case. By the time Parker worked at the school, it had become commonplace for photographers to go door to door to each department to ask if they needed anything photography related before the holiday break. It was suspected McLennan did this as well. So perhaps it was not that the virus found a way to float through pipes or windows to her, but that she came to its domain. Could someone have handed her something that had been cross-contaminated in the lab? Could she have entered unbeknownst to others? For what it's worth, an investigation into the incident found that Dr. Bedson was not culpable. The WHO investigated lab procedures, and they had maintained the proper protocols for handling the virus. Ideally, they would have had an entirely separate lab for it, but since smallpox was basically seen as eradicated, that type of investment made little sense. The investigation's outcome may have been a relief for his family, that his good name would be preserved, but it was too late for Dr. Bedson. And I can only wonder if it would have mattered to him, someone who appeared to have valued his personal and professional integrity so highly that the virus got out of his lab and infected anyone at all. May have made him feel at fault on a personal level, if not a logistical one. To this day, no one knows exactly why or how this medical photographer became infected with this virulent strain of smallpox. In the days following her father's death and the death of Dr. Bedson, Parker's condition deteriorated rapidly. By the third week, she had lost sight in both eyes. Her face was layered with encrusted scabs from the burst pox, and she had developed pneumonia, a common complication of smallpox. Janet's husband, Joseph, decided not to visit her in those final days, telling the nurses it would upset her too much. While the contact tracing and quarantining had been a massive success in stopping the spread of smallpox throughout the community, there would be one more infection. On September 7th, just 3 days after her husband's death, Hilda Parker was admitted to the same hospital as her daughter. It was presumed the rash she had developed was just another vaccine reaction. However, she did end up testing positive for smallpox. On September 11th, Janet Parker became the last known person to die of smallpox anywhere in the world. Her mother, still under quarantine, could not attend her husband or her daughter's funeral. Janet Parker's funeral procession was followed by unmarked law enforcement vehicles. This wasn't just any funeral or any body. Despite the tragic circumstances, her body still had to be treated as a biohazard. They followed so that if there was an accident, they could contain the scene. The funeral was the lone one at the cemetery that day, as all others were canceled for safety reasons. Even the crematorium where her body was promptly delivered was deep cleaned after her cremation. Hilda, Janet's mother, was finally discharged on September 22nd. Her case was relatively mild. She had been vaccinated as a child, and she had received a booster along with everyone else who had come into contact with her daughter. She had also had antiviral treatment administered. But while she had survived, this tiny particle had managed to take so much away from her so quickly. Those who had worked on this outbreak, from the epidemiologists to the bedside nurses, were permanently changed for months or years afterwards, citing depression and haunting images of a woman whose body was ravaged by this insidious illness. Smallpox was officially declared eradicated by the WHO in May of 1980, just shy of 2 years after Janet's death. While the virus no longer exists in the natural world, it is still held in 2 labs, at the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia, and the State Research Center of Biotechnology and Virology in Kosovo, Russia. Discussion of whether those samples should be destroyed is revisited periodically. The use of smallpox as a bioweapon is a fear. If it was used, we would be victims of humanity's success against the virus. Now that it is gone, and thus there is no need to vaccinate against it, and no cases in the wild to provide natural immunity to lucky survivors, there is very little immunity in the current population. If the virus were to break free, it would take a mass vaccination effort and enormous stockpiles of the vaccination to combat its spread. This type of planning takes commitment from governing bodies and world leaders in the form of funding and oversight, and for people to believe that vaccines work. Both things that, as of this date, are contentious topics in the public sphere. For now, we live in the comfort of knowing that this ancient virus, so dreadful it has shaped history, is tucked away in 2 labs in 2 distinct countries that have historically gotten along fabulously.